All right. Hello and welcome back to the Language Lab, the podcast for English teaching majors. I'm Angel, and with me today is my colleague Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Angel. Today we're diving into a classic debate from our textbook, The Study of Language, 7th edition by George Yule. I have a question. Is learning a second language as natural and easy as learning your first? Well, we will be arguing that first language acquisition, or L1, is a special innate process that can't be replicated.
I like it, but actually, let me tell you that I'll be taking the other side. While I agree that processes are different, I believe that learning a second language, or L2, is a powerful cognitive process in its own right, with its own path to success. Let's get started and see what our textbook has to say.
Perfect. Well, why not to start with the arguments, right? So I think that we can begin with the biggest point for my side, which is covered in chapter 13, the critical period. The book explains that children acquire language during a specific window of time from birth to puberty, when their brains are incredibly flexible. This is a biological advantage. A baby doesn't learn language, their brain just naturally absorbs it from the environment. So this is very interesting because it is like a sponge. Yule even mentions the tragic case of Genie, who was deprived of linguistic input during this period. The fact that she was never able to fully develop grammatical complex speech is powerful evidence that this window is real, and once it is closed, it's very difficult to open it again.
Oh, interesting. And I have a question to that, Kevin. You also mentions in chapter 14 that success in L2 learning often depends on motivation. Don't you think a highly motivated adult who wants to learn a language for a better job or to live a new culture can compensate for this so-called critical period? You can tell me that the need to communicate isn't a powerful motivator.
Yes, but that is the point. Motivation is required for L2 or learning a second language, right? Learning because it's not a natural process. For a child, acquisition is effortless. They don't need a reason to acquire their first language. It just happens, and let's also not forget that the emotional side. Children are fearless, they babble and make mistakes without being self-conscious. This is a huge barrier for adults, isn't it? You'll describe these affected factors like a fear of embarrassment or a feeling of vulnerability that can completely shut down an L2 learner. A child never has this problem. What about you? Do you ever feel self-conscious when you make a mistake in English?
Of course I do, Kevin, but that's a human emotional response, not a linguistic behavior. I'd also point out that a child's motivation is simply an innate existential urge to communicate. We as adults just have different, more complex motivations that can be just as strong. All right, so let's move to my argument. So building on that, as adults, we bring a level of cognitive maturity that children lack. We can consciously use learning strategies. We can study grammar rules, look up vocabulary, and practice pronunciation with an intention that a 2-year-old doesn't have. Our knowledge of the world in our first language gave us a huge advantage.
Okay, so basically you're saying that memorizing rule is as effective as the natural process of building an internal grammar, but if that is the case, why do L2 learners make so many errors that come from their first language? Our textbook calls this negative transfer or L1 interference. Isn't that proof that the L1 gets in the way of building a new independent language system? For example, I want to tell you this. My L1 Spanish, right? Spanish is my native language, right? Makes me want to say I had 15 years old, which is incorrect. Instead of saying I am 15 years old, that is a perfect example of L1 interference. A child learning Spanish would never make that mistake.
But that's my point, Kevin. Transfer isn't always negative. It can be a huge advantage. For us, as you mentioned, as Spanish speakers learning English, we can use our knowledge of Spanish to understand many English words that are similar, like family and familia, or information and información. Your book highlights that this positive transfer is a huge help that a baby doesn't have. So the first language is a foundation, not just a barrier.
Perfect, excellent. So I think that now we can talk about the comparison and evaluation, right? So, okay, so let's talk about the linguistic output. Yule describes how children create telegraphic speech and then naturally start adding morphemes. This shows that they are building a real language system from the ground up. And adults' errors, on the other hand, are often because of their L1, the first language, right? Not because they are developing a new system. Their interlanguage is a mix, not a pure. Developing a version of the L2 is a fossilized version of their linguistic past.
Well, I'd argue that the inner language is a sign of an active mind. It's a creative system the learners is building on their way to fluency. The fact that it's systematic with its own rules is a sign of development, just like a child's errors. A child's mistakes are a sign of growth. So why is in adults inner language considered the same? And what about input? The book talks about how important input is for both. An adult can intentionally seek out more varied and complex input through books, movies, and podcasts, which a child simply cannot.
That is true, but the quality of that input is often different. A child gets tailored one-on-one caregiver speech. An adult gets the full, unedited, and often chaotic world of the language. So while adults may get more quantity, children get higher quality input, and that's perfectly suited to their learning stage.
Okay, Kevin, that's a fair point about the quality of input. So let me ask you this. Do you think that an adult who starts learning a second language at age, let's say 25, can still become bilingual and communicate effectively, even if they never sound exactly like a native speaker?
Yes, of course. So my point isn't about success of communication, but about the process. An adult can be a brilliant communicator in a second language, but they will likely always have an accent or make subtle grammar mistakes that a native speaker would never make. So this brings us right back to the idea that L1 first language acquisition is as a special, flawless process that again, I like to mention this phrase, this cannot be replicated.
And I believe that success of a second language learner overcoming age barriers and first language interference through effort and motivation is just as impressive. It's not more so. It's not the same process, I mean, as we just discussed, right? But the outcome can be a beautiful and useful form of bilingualism.
Yeah, that is true. And I think that we have covered a lot today, as well as we have talked about the critical period, affected factors, transfer in our language, and the role of motivation. And I think that we can agree that processes involve a lot of practice and interaction.
Exactly, Kevin. And that the environment and people you interact with are crucial for both. Our book, The Study of Language, makes that very, very clear.
Correct. But you know what? For me, the effortless, biologically driven nature of first language acquisition makes it a fundamentally different and more successful process. So this is like a miracle of the human mind that, according to the book, again, cannot be replicated.
Exactly. And for me, the deliberate effort and cognitive strategies of second language learners combined with a powerful motivation make their journey a truly impressive and successful one. The outcome might not be identical, but it is just as valid. It's clear that there is no simple answer and that both sides have strong arguments.
So I agree with you. Thank you for a great debate. Thank you for listening and join us next time on the Language Love. Bye bye. See you next
Bye. See
time.
you next time. Bye for now.